Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the NPC Dungeon podcast, where I, your host and game master for the time being, talk about advice and tricks that I like to use that hopefully we can all use to become better game masters and dungeon masters ourselves. Let's learn something. Anyway, today's episode is going to be all about combat. It's a pretty prevalent concept in D&D and really many other tabletop games as well. You have to face it, much of the time your players are going to be spending in the game is going to be in combat, and it can be easy to find yourself in a bit of a rut and just throw monster after monster at your players without any real variation, and that can get kind of taxing for them and more than a little boring, not just for them but also for you as well. And obviously there are a lot of ways to break the monotony by, for example, introducing different kinds of encounters, social encounters, investigations, mysteries, occasional puzzle. But today I want to talk about ways to keep that monotony from even forming in the first place. So let's begin. Now, the first thing that I want to say about combat, and I'll try to keep this point kind of brief because I'll be saying so much of this throughout the course of this podcast and in other episodes, and it really applies to so much more than just combat. And that's this: plan for player chaos. In fact, I probably will make a whole episode about just this and still be able to talk much more about it. I can talk for hours just about this, but today I'll keep it kind of brief and I'll keep my discussion under just combat for today. But it kind of makes sense, right? Combat can be unpredictable, and your players might want to find creative solutions and alternative paths through and maybe even around the combat encounters that you give to them. In fact, you want them to be doing this. You want them to be having fun, thinking outside the box, and trying to deconstruct what you've built for them. But that obviously gives you a lot to consider and can be kind of challenging to deal with. So what do? Well, just like with anything else, the first step starts long before the session actually begins. If I am planning a combat encounter that I think poses alternate scenarios, or that I think my players will want to complete in a different way than just crowding it and turning it into a living blade sharpener, I'll try to think of, and come up with as many alternatives as I can. Maybe they'll want to tame the wolf, turn it on its master, or even talk the human leading the wolf down. Pretend that you are in this combat and think about the kinds of things that you would try. But you might be thinking, I'm not my players. How would I know what they want to do? You're right. And this is very important. This is why during the campaign, you need to be watching your players, seeing the kinds of decisions they make in game, and try to anticipate the kind of things they'll want to do. Let's say, for example, you have a flashy bard. You might expect that player to make a show of their combat and maybe try to win the people over with their displays of cunning and wit. On the other hand, you might have a more diplomatic character who wants to negotiate rather than fight, and try to win over allies they can use later on. But obviously everyone's playstyle is different, of course. Both of these solutions, and many others, are completely valid, and this is important. If one of your players comes up with an idea and they roll well enough for it, and it's a good idea, and hey, even if it's not a good idea, by all means, it should be allowed to work. Don't continue straight through with your plans because you like your idea better, or because you just don't want their idea to happen, or because you're mad at them. Definitely not because you're mad at them. It's never a good idea. There are better ways of handling that. Or even because you're just having trouble coming up with an alternative. Because remember, it's all about improv. And also remember, it's not just about you. It's about everyone. You and your players should all be having fun, and you and your players all play a role in that fun. This is why we think of these things ahead of time. And again, you're right to question this. You won't be able to think of everything beforehand. That doesn't mean you don't plan. Quite the opposite. The more you plan for, even if those alternatives don't happen, because they probably won't happen, the more instances and events and whatnot you'll have in your toolbox, so to speak. It won't be hard then to take something that you did plan for, that's maybe similar to what your player decided to do, and modify it a little and repurpose it for whatever combat you happen to be running at the time. And the last thing that I want to say about this point is that combat is structured for a reason. Well, many reasons. Use this to your advantage. Obviously, during your players' turns, you'll be narrating and guiding the game, but in the back of your mind, be thinking of what could happen, what is happening, and how you plan to respond. This structure, the way combat is structured, gives you time to plan and think of these things. Use it to your advantage. But while you're not having to constantly rack your brain for new solutions and alternatives, help the players have a little bit more fun and really paint their experience here by flavoring as much of the combat as you can. This one I'm going to try to keep kind of brief as well, probably even more brief than that last point. And that's because so much of what else I'm going to say throughout this episode is going to come back to this. So instead of just dumping it all right here, there are certain points that I'm going to touch on later on where I'll kind of harken back to this idea of kind of flavoring the combat. It's really easy to just say, okay, you stab the mimic, but I challenge you to think of as many possible ways that you can flavor this, add to it, and make it as unique as possible. Maybe they don't just stab it, maybe they're able to pierce their sword into some of the gaps between the boards and its chest-like facade and snap a piece of it off. Maybe they stand over it and jam their sword down over the lid, bending it backwards until they can start to hear its hide begin to snap under the strain. And these extra little descriptions even have the added bonus of giving your players extra little hints as how to defeat the monsters you've given them. And the same goes for your monsters. If you didn't hear my last episode, I highly recommend you give it a listen. It's about one of my favorite combat encounters that I've ever run. Long story short, I had my players fight a bodak, which is a creature that can kill something just by looking at it. Honestly, it's one of my favorites. And if you go back and listen to it, I never just say that my players just hit or miss. There's a part when the Blackguard Paladin Thane actually goes in to swing his sword at the creature's torso, but he misses. I decided to flavor this as the bodak being able to deftly sidestep it, grab him by the wrist, and push his arm back. Then, on the bodak's turn, he didn't just attack, he kicked. Find that there are many different ways of not just making your players, and more relevantly for you, your monsters, moves in combat fun and exciting, but also different, varied, and interesting. The bodak didn't just grapple Harold, it held him effortlessly by his throat precariously over the chasm and dropped him over the edge. As one of my players actually once put it, you can flavor anything to make sense. And this is so true. This is one of the greatest DM, GM weapons in your arsenal. And the last thing that I want to say about this point is keep the continuity of the progression of the combat that you're running in mind. That is to say, use what just happened and what is probably going to happen to give you inspiration for how to describe the combat. Did the giant that your players are fighting just knock a building over? You can have other NPCs that are fighting alongside your players start to climb the side and use this to get a better vantage point on the monster. Did one of your players just shoot an arrow at a raging mulet? Maybe it turns on them in hatred and anger and charges them. But that's all I want to say about that, because I'm starting to kind of encroach on another one of my points, like I said I would, and that is use the environment. Fights have to happen somewhere, right? Combat never occurs in a vacuum, and it shouldn't in our games either. Remember, you're the one who gets to create these areas in which the combat actually occurs. I encourage you, try to make sure that your players and whatever or whoever they're fighting aren't the only things playing decisive roles in your combat. Just like in the example I mentioned earlier, if your players are fighting a giant in an urban setting, don't be afraid to have this giant start knocking buildings over, giving your players something else to dodge. The bodak that I described in the last episode also used the environment. If you remember, it tried to throw one of my players over the side of a bridge. So, as you can see, there are all kinds of ways to make an environment that your NPCs can use against the players. But remember, if your NPCs can use it, then your players can too. Remember, Thane also tried to tackle the bodak off the bridge. I actually even once had a player try to grapple onto a flying animated sword and use it to try to fly over and get the drop on a gargoyle that he and the party were fighting at the time. And again, you want your players to be doing this. One of the tricks that I like to employ to encourage them to start using the environment and to start thinking creatively and tactically is to have the monsters and the enemies that they're fighting start to do this. One such encounter that I ran had my players come across a wolf that had been turned completely into stone by a group of cockatrices that lived in the area. Shortly after my players got there, a couple flew overhead and tried to drop a big log on top of them. Is that quite as effective as turning them into stone? No, not at all. But it's interesting. Your goal obviously isn't just to kill your players' characters, and using the environment can even be a fun, creative way to avoid premature player death. It can also be a fun and creative way to provide obstacles for your players and add an extra layer of difficulty to an otherwise relatively bland combat encounter. It's an easy way to take your players out of their comfort zone. One time, I had a group of players who had come across a village of creatures who lived in settlements in the trees of a marshy forest. These people told my players that a sacred site for them had recently come under attack by a hideous monster that just ended up being a giant frog, and asked the players to go and clear it out. They told them that the safest way to get there was through the trees because that particular path had been overrun by an ocean of carnivorous ants that lived on the forest floor below. So my players had to jump and climb their way through the canopy, all while dodging the attacks of various assassin vines that had detected them and decided to ambush them. And there are, of course, many ways of using the environment to make your combat just a little more challenging. Maybe they're high up in the air and in constant danger of being knocked down and falling to their deaths. Or maybe they're on a boat or an airship. Weather can always pose a fun problem both during and even outside of combat in those situations. But of course, the environment isn't just a way to hinder your players. As I said before, they can use it too. This is much harder to plan for and adds extra variables that you have to account for. And this is kind of what I was talking about during that first point, but it's still completely worth planning for and completely worth accounting for. If your combat occurs in a cave, for example, maybe plan for your players to try to collapse the cave. If it occurs in a forest or a wooden cabin or really any flammable place, you should definitely plan for your players to try to burn it down. But I'll add a word of caution here. Be careful when placing specific things for your players to do. Remember, this is not a video game. Your players generally shouldn't have to do anything. What I like to do is just create environments with what I like to call moving parts, which are just elements that come into play during combat, and see what happens. Your players will surprise you, and this surprise is how you can get some of the most fun, memorable, and creative moments in some of your games. And no, again, you'll never be able to plan for everything, but the more things you can think of, the better able you'll be to react not just to your players using the environment, but also to many of the creative ideas or plans they may hatch along the way during the combat. But using the environment isn't the only creative thing that your monsters and NPCs can do during combat. See, if you're anything like me, when I first started out, making combat difficult might be a little challenging. You obviously don't want to kill your players' characters, and it'd be tough to really scale an enemy properly, balancing the difficulty with a good chance of player success. You want your players to come out of most combat encounters triumphant and victorious after a hard-fought battle. There are times when combat should be easy, sure, and there are times when they just have to run away. But the advice that I'm going to give here will apply mainly to that majority of combat encounters where there should be a level of difficulty involved. And for these encounters, you'll find that your players will probably actually appreciate that hard-earned victory much more over an easy win. And the last thing you want is for your players to start thinking they're invincible and stop taking precautions. And if you're worried about making the combat too difficult, remember, you're the one controlling whatever they're fighting. Sometimes you just have to fudge a dice roll, tone down the enemy's powers a little, or even have them make a tactical error or two. And if all else fails, you can always have a helpful NPC come in and bail the players out. Obviously, don't overuse that last one, or any of them. It might take all the stakes away from the combat. As you run more combat, you'll kind of get a feel for which monsters to use and how to make certain combat more difficult or less difficult, especially given different players. You'll learn your party, and you'll know what's right as you go on. But chances are, if you're here, you don't want to know why you should be doing this. You want to know how to do this. So, how can you make your combat just a little bit more difficult? A good place to start is with the book. At least as a place to begin, use the monsters that the book provides. If you're playing D&D, delve into the monster manual. If you're playing Pathfinder, that means look into the bestiary. Most combat-heavy tabletop RPG systems that I'm familiar with anyway, usually have some kind of indicator that tells you just how difficult the creatures your players will be finding will be. In D&D, for example, according to the Monsters Manual and DM's Guide too, I believe, this is called CR, or Challenge Rating. This is essentially the level of your players, a party of 4, needs to be in order to defeat this creature with a relative level of difficulty. And you can use this to modify the difficulty of the combat. If you want an easier combat, pick a lower CR creature. If you want a more difficult combat, pick one with a higher CR, or use multiple creatures. This especially comes in handy with the players with magic items or NPC followers. Likewise, if you have a party that is larger or smaller than 4, it might be a good idea to pick a creature with a slightly higher or slightly lower CR respectively. But beware, the DM's guide even says this is not an exact science, and it's easy to see why. Enemies have a lot of abilities that make them more or less difficult to defeat. For example, let's say a praying creature that doesn't have too much HP or attack power, but it has an instant kill ability. That would probably raise CR a little bit. Looking at the different abilities different monsters have kind of makes making a unified system to compare them with, a bit like comparing apples and oranges. So use your judgment, especially as you grow as DM and learn your party that you're playing with in your games in particular. Right along with this point, another important thing to take note of is that it's really, really important to know the game that you're running. For example, I used to run 3.5 a lot, and in 3.5, it isn't a great idea to try to make combat more difficult by increasing the enemy's HP or by making more of them. All this does is turn the combat into a long, drawn-out slugfest war of attrition that drones on until the enemies eventually have to retreat to end it. And that's neither fun nor satisfying. But in 5e, where the powers, abilities, spells, and attacks are scaled up a little bit, that might be a perfectly balanced and valid approach. However, you're not just beholden to what's in the book. Now we get to kind of some of the fun stuff of preparing for combat. You can also make your own monster by just simply borrowing the stat block of a pre-made creature, or giving them a bunch of abilities similar to a creature of desired CR. You can also modify creatures in the books by adding or taking away certain abilities. As a quick example, one of the things that I like doing is giving creatures abilities that improve their grapple, either by letting them do it as a bonus action, letting them do it for free after making a successful melee attack, or something else. But that's just one of the many, many, many ways that you could go about doing this. You could take inspiration from the books, and you can branch out and branch out and branch out until you have something completely new and hopefully completely balanced for the combat you're planning. And just like you're not just restricted to using the book, you're also not just restricted to using the rules to make your combat more difficult. One of the things that I like to do is use tactics. I could probably make a whole episode just about this topic, and I probably will one day. And you'll notice this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about using the environment and flavoring the combat. A lot of tactics are going to involve the environment, and what your monsters do will by default flavor the combat. But to keep it short and simple, your monsters and NPCs that will be fighting your players won't just run up and try to stab them or something. Maybe you have a clever hunter who lures the party into her hunting grounds where she has traps spread out. Or maybe you have a single monster, but even then, you can think of the order in which they'll do certain attacks and moves and the kind of plans they would have. For example, Beholder would probably try to use its anti-magic cone to pacify any magic users while using its own magic to restrain and kill the other players. And of course, it generally wouldn't track the players down. It would generally require that the players bring the fight to it. It might keep an eye on them until they get there, and when they do, its lair would be full of all kinds of traps. And of course, we can't forget about minions. What's their role? There are a lot of things to keep track of and keep in mind while you're trying to plan out the combat and tactics for the monsters you're running. And I would like to, as you know I like to do by now, go over an example of an encounter that I once ran. Just for a brief second. I had my players go into a forest and then came across a crossroads where there were a few kobolds standing down the other way. Kobolds are kind of weak, tiny creatures, but my players didn't see the ones waiting in the trees on either side of them. So even a kobold can be powerful in the right circumstances if you use the right tactics to empower them. But I have to be honest, I got that idea from the book. This goes right back to what I was saying earlier. You can start out by looking in the book and take inspiration from that, and before you know it, you'll be using tactics to bewilder and baffle your players and really put them through their paces. So I know I kind of beat this point to death already, but I have one more thing to mention before I go on to the next point, and that is you can also give your monsters and enemies a magic item. This will make them by default a little bit more tough to defeat, but it'll also give your players incentive to defeat them and have them earn a whole new magic item. Just make sure that you have a good reason why your monster or other enemy has this item, which actually brings me to my next point. This is make sure your combat has an in-universe reason. This is so important. Have you ever ran a combat encounter that your party just kind of made fun of and said, wait, why are the monsters just standing there? Well, it's no fun, and it's something we want to avoid. Sometimes you want to say the joke's on them because there is a reason. They just don't know it, but you don't want to rely on that. If you ever find yourself in a situation like this, ask yourself, what could I have done to have the reason for this combat a little more obvious? Often, it can be as easy as a simple survival check or a detail that you drop in an action that your monster does. Your ideas may be really rich and complex, but generally they need to come across as simple and easy to understand for your party. This helps the game run a lot more smoothly and even assists a little bit with the storytelling. Yes, I'm going to go back to the Bodak encounter again for another example. It was just, I learned so much from this encounter. You might be wondering, why was this guy just chilling in the treasure room? Well, Bodak's creatures killed by pure evil. The necromancer killed them, experimented on them, and used what they became to guard her treasure. A really fun cliche that we all like and we all know and love, but we all kind of like to laugh at a little bit, is the big empty room for a boss battle. We always ask, okay, why is the boss just sitting in this big empty room? Well, I still like using this, but you can give it an in-universe reason as to why the boss is just sitting in this big empty room. In one of my previous campaigns, I played this to where this boss was sent to guard a certain item. However, the powerful magic this item gave off changed them and morphed them into something else and corrupted the area around them until it trapped them inside. But not all reasons for combat have to be this convoluted. Sometimes your players just run into a monster, plain and simple, end of story. Just don't be afraid to get creative with it. You have to fail a little bit in order to learn these lessons. And lastly, piggybacking directly off of this point is my last point, and this one's very fun. Play the enemy. This one kind of goes back to what I said earlier about flavoring the combat. See what I mean about that point being so prevalent? It's important to know what your monster's motivations are. Maybe you have a really powerful wizard who holds back because he just wants to test the players. Maybe he'll give advice throughout the combat. Or maybe you just have a nihilistic lunatic who only wants destruction, even at their own demise. There are many possible motivations to give your enemies, and this can help guide how they interact in combat and how you flavor all the things they do. I once ran a kind of anarchistic maniac creature, not unlike the Bodak. I'm finding I run a lot of these. Weird. Anyway, it was quiet, it was calculated, all its moves were intentional, and it escaped just barely in the night after facing down all of my players. But honestly, that's all I want to say about that. I actually plan on telling this story on a future episode. Either way, I'm going to end it right there. I could talk about this forever, so look out for a future episode on combat. And as always, until next time, let's learn something.